Please welcome Mitzi Perdue, author, professional speaker, businesswoman.
How do you get the people around you to go the extra mile and outperform other people? Well, I got to learn some of this. I had my first lesson in this right at the beginning of our marriage. We met in February, we were married in July, and by August we had come back from our honeymoon, and we were visiting friends in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, and we're walking along the beach in Watch Hill, and it was early in the morning, nobody else was there, and we're walking along with our sandals, barefoot, and just a really romantic thing. And then, out of the blue, I look at Frank and I tell him, Frank, I think we should have every single person who works for the company for our home for dinner. Well, that struck him as totally out of the blue and nut burgers. And he said, no, Mitzi, that's completely impossible. There's 16,000 people. You can't do that. And I pretended I wasn't processing the word no. And I said, I think we should have them 100 at a time. And he said, no, that's way too many. And then I told him, this is August. Let's start in September. No, that's way too soon. And then I told him, well, we ought to include the secretaries when we start, because the secretaries can tell everybody that our parties are fun and not scary. And so it went for several rounds of him saying no and me just barreling on as if I didn't process the word no. But as we continued, with me planning this thing, I noticed that his attitude sort of changed from, no, this is crazy, what planet did you set down from? It began to change to, maybe there's something to it. And finally, I heard these wonderful words, I like it. And so it was that about 6 weeks later, we did start something that continued for 17 years. For 17 years, pretty much 3 times a month, we would have 100 people over at a time. And we did start with the secretaries. But I realized later that by accident, I had hit on something about Frank that meant that the suggestion that I had made, just in the end, he really embraced it. Initially, he had didn't like the idea because for those of you who've seen Frank in the television ads, you may be aware that he has a great television personality, but in fact, in person, he was a fairly shy person. And the idea of having 100 people in his home week after week, going through 16,000, this was way, 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 way outside his comfort zone. But once he realized that having people at his home would be a way of signaling to them how important they were to him, he embraced the idea. In fact, he loved it because, as far as I could tell, during our entire 17 years of marriage, he was absolutely always on the lookout for ways that he could show the people who worked with him how important they were. Well, what were these parties like? They were 100 at a time, and we very deliberately invited people in groups where they would feel comfortable with each other. Because Frank was, he had enough emotional intelligence to be very aware that, say, I don't know what part of the company to use as an example, but supposing you're a trucker or a veterinarian or an accountant or whoever, that it might be a little bit intimidating to be invited to Frank Perdue's home, the big boss. And so we very deliberately invited people in groups who would know each other. But the goal was to, over time, to include absolutely everybody. And at these parties, Frank did something that was very typical of Frank and that I recommend to everybody. He made sure that every one of his guests, that he spent some time with that person, showing them total attention. They were the most important person in his world at that moment. And he was just a wonderful, wonderful host. But something else that he did that I just admired to the outer limits, we had our living room actually held 150 people, and sometimes we had groups that large, but we had a great big buffet table. and there might be 5 or 6 people serving it. But Frank himself would stand at the beginning of the buffet table, and he would wait on the people who worked for him. And I'd be standing aside, just observing this and thinking, how many other heads of Fortune 500 size companies would wait on their employees? You hear the phrase servant leadership, and I was thinking, I'm watching it. He's waiting on the people who work for him. And another thing that he'd always do at these parties, I said that he was a shy man, but he wasn't so shy that he wouldn't stand up in front of his employees. And at the end of the evening, he'd tell them what was going on in the company. He'd tell the challenges, the things that were going wrong, the things that we were really struggling with. But he'd also tell what the opportunities and what was going right. And that meant that supposing that you're a trucker or a secretary or just anybody in the whole company, you get to hear right from the head of the whole company what's going on in the company. And that I think that must give them a feeling of like ownership, because they're in on the inside of what we're up against and what we're trying to do and what the vision is. And at the end of these parties, every time, he would stand up. Well, he's already been telling what's going on in the company, but he'd also accept questions. And then at the very end, he'd give some version of the words that I'm about to say, which is, this is Frank speaking, I know that the company wouldn't be what it is today without each of you. Thank you. Well, afterwards, I would hear from the employees, and they're called associates in Perdue speak. I would hear from the associates as they're leaving that what an exciting time and how much this meant to them. And then I've actually attended funerals where the next of kin would tell me that the deceased, who was a Perdue associate, that having dinner at our house was one of the most meaningful things in the deceased's life, because the deceased felt honored and important. And so I think one of the secrets of what made Frank such a success was that he was willing really to he would go over and above to make the people who worked with him feel important. And Frank was very aware of a quotation which I will share with you. The quotation is from the great psychiatrist, William James. He lived 100 years ago. And William James said, and I'm going to quote it, and I hope it sinks in because it's so important and it motivated Frank. The deepest principle of human nature is the craving for appreciation. And Frank knew how to give it at these parties. So again, one of the things that I think made Frank a huge success was that he was always on the lookout for ways of making people feel important and valued.